Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jason Jaffe, Vice President of the Harvard International Relations Council. On behalf of the Harvard International Relations Council and the Institute of Politics, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kurt Waldheim. Dr. Waldheim began his distinguished career in the Austrian Foreign Ministry, where he served in various positions, ending up as ambassador to Canada. After his ambassadorship to Canada, he was appointed Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs in 1968. In 1971, he was elected Secretary General of the United Nations, where he served until 1981. Currently, Dr. Waldheim splits his time between being chairman of the Interaction Council for former heads of government and being a lecturer at Georgetown University, where he's writing his memoirs. Dr. Waldheim will speak tonight on the current crisis of confidence in international relations. He will be followed by a short question and answer period. It is my great honor to introduce to you Dr. Kurt Waldheim.
Thank you very much, Jason Jaffe, for your kind words of introduction. I certainly appreciated what you said about me, and it reminded me what Adlai Stevenson once said when he was introduced. He said, well, praise is fine as long as you don't inhale it. So, well, since I am now a private citizen, it is not necessary anymore to inhale praise, but I'm indeed grateful to you for having invited me to this impressive gathering of students and professors, people who are interested in international affairs. And I think right now this makes a lot of sense, because never before we were faced with such tremendous challenges. Our gathering here indeed coincides with a clear and frightening deterioration in the relationship between East and West, and especially between the two superpowers, Moscow and Washington. There is an increasing uneasiness as to the relationship between the two powers, whose negative trend reflects on the whole fabric of international cooperation. The arms race, especially the competition in nuclear weapons, continues unabated, representing not only a severe risk to human survival, but also a tremendous waste of human and other vital resources. A number of regional disputes remain unresolved and continue to give rise to violence and frustration. The effort to devise global economic solutions suitable to present realities remains deadlocked, while poverty and economic disaster threaten large segments of the world's population. These uncertain and unforeseen developments affect in different ways the rise of deep-seated feelings of anxiety and frustration, which in turn create a climate favorable to new and unpredictable events. Well, I speak to you, my dear friends, as the former manager of an enterprise whose product is not always visible and whose customers do not always honor their contracts, the United Nations. It is an enterprise whose prime resource is the concept of human solidarity, transcending ideological differences, whose sales are measured by adherence to principles of the United Nations Charter, and whose profits are counted in the benefits of peace and the betterment of human lives. We often speak of what we like to call the international community, but we are only at the early stages in developing a community sense of shared objectives and of the need for common efforts. We are increasingly aware of the complex web of interdependence, the connections causes and effects that bind nations together, yet balanced against the impulses that unite the world community are the forces that tend to divide us. They are much stronger. Mistrust and suspicion, nationalistic rivalries, ignorance, and misguided notions of honor and prestige. With such conflicting tendencies, namely order and disorder, it is not easy to predict the state of the world in the next century, even though it is close at hand. Indeed, it is the absence of predictability that marks our world today and causes such great anxiety. Ladies and gentlemen, whether we like it or not, East-West relationship is the dominant factor in international affairs today. It has its repercussions on the disarmament negotiations, the North-South dialogue, and the chances for a solution of the many regional conflicts in the world. However, there is no confidence between the superpowers at all. Their actions are guided by mistrust and suspicion, as I said a moment ago. Therefore, the arms race continues unabated, and most of the regional conflicts remain unresolved. There is a growing tendency to rely on public diplomacy, and I wish to criticize that heavily. That reliance on public diplomacy, public statements, public speeches, whatever a government wants to say, it is not using the normal channels of communication, the diplomatic channels. Why do we have diplomacy if we don't use it? No, public statements are made on both sides, believing that the other side will accept this. No, the other side will be provoked, will feel provoked by this. They want to talk to each other, not to be provoked. So let's get away from public diplomacy and return to real diplomacy, to quiet, discreet diplomacy. This is the only way to achieve results. In recent statements, the new leaders in Moscow created the impression that they were willing to improve relations with Washington if the United States government was ready to negotiate on the basis of equality and equal security. They also stressed the importance of large-scale measures for strengthening trust, confidence between the two nations, and mutual consideration for legitimate interests of the other side. What I want to say is that one can't always think of its own interests or one's own interest. We have to put our shoes in the shoes of others in order to understand better the situation. And I think this is not done. This is true for both sides. I'm not trying to criticize one or the other side. I'm sorry to say that on both sides there is this mistrust and a certain selfishness to think just of ourselves and not of the others. In this way we can't achieve anything. The demand for the removal of Pershing II and cruise missiles from Europe was not repeated in recent statements by the Russians only a few days ago. They always insisted that any dialogue must be preceded by the removal of the Pershing and cruise missiles, those modern American missiles in Europe. Now, I hope I'm right, I haven't heard anything about this recently. It was also not mentioned to my knowledge in the talks Vice President Bush had with Chernenko. So this is a positive sign. Let's hope that it is really so and that they will not come with this problem again. At any rate, I interpret this as an indication of a more flexible attitude of the new leaders in Moscow. Vice President Bush's meeting with Konstantin Chernenko on the occasion of the funeral for Mr. Andropov was certainly helpful and may pave the way for a later summit meeting. I think those personal meetings are always good. I do not share the view that you always have to come home with concrete results. That is very difficult in international affairs. But the fact alone that two leaders are getting together, especially if they represent the two greatest powers in the world, is in itself already a positive step. Well, of course, a summit meeting is not an easy doing, but perhaps during the next General Assembly of the United Nations, such a summit meeting may be possible. This would have the advantage that the two leaders could meet without the cumbersome protocol of a normal state visit, which is rather cumbersome with all those dinners and luncheons and other receptions. It's much easier in the United Nations, where you just get together and talk to each other. So I would think and even suggest that the two sides should explore this possibility. That would also give them enough time, the new leadership in Moscow and the administration here in this country, to think the matter over, to watch the further developments between now and September, when the UN General Assembly begins in New York. I have seen that. For 10 years I witnessed these things, and there were many summit meetings in New York during the General Assembly, without the fuss of an official state visit, just to get together and to talk business. At any rate, with the passing away of Mr. Andropov and the election of a new leader in the Soviet Union, there may be a new chance for the reopening of an improved dialogue between Moscow and Washington, which we so badly need. But having said this, let me give you an immediate warning. There was and is a collective leadership in Moscow. With the exception of Stalin, only Khrushchev ignored this principle, which finally led to his downfall, because he ignored the collective leadership. Brezhnev respected it scrupulously. No decision was made by him without consulting the Politburo. I am sure that Konstantin Chernenko, an old, well-established party veteran, will also respect the advice of the collective leadership, which has already governed the country during the last years when Brezhnev was very sick. It would therefore be a mistake, and it would be rather naive, to expect dramatic changes in Moscow's foreign policy in the near future just because a new leader has taken power. We will rather have a period of not too much movement during the next months. I referred at the beginning to the ever-increasing arms race. Well, the nuclear weapons have now acquired a unique role in international affairs, and the future of mankind is hostage to the perceived security of a few nuclear powers or nuclear weapon states. I do not want to repeat here the well-known arguments against nuclear armament. You know it, you read the papers, you hear the media every day. Of course, we are deeply worried, and I am the first one to recognize the great danger of the nuclear arms race. However, let me say this, the issue is not, as it is always described, a technical one. How many warheads can we have on both sides? Is it possible to have a freeze of the production of nuclear weapons, or is it not possible? What carriers and how many carriers should be permitted, etc. No, it is not a technical question. Let's recognize this. Disarmament is a highly political question. And if it were possible to improve the relations between the main nuclear powers, which are again the two superpowers, they have over 90% of nuclear weapons. If it were possible to improve the relations between them and to restore a minimum of trust, progress in the negotiations, in the technical negotiations on arms control and the reduction and finally the elimination of nuclear weapons would be possible, no doubt. But to achieve this political climate, personal contacts between the leaders of the two countries and the two military alliances are important. And in my opinion, such contacts should not only be established on the level of the leaders of the two countries, but hopefully also on other levels. There are, for instance, there is the military leadership, the chiefs of staff, and people like those leading military officers who have a very important influence in both countries. So they should meet, as well as the representatives of the people. Here, Congress, on the Russian side, representatives, they do have something like a parliament. It doesn't have the same function as the Congress here in this country or in Western European countries, but still it is composed of representatives of the people. So these people should get together in order to create a better atmosphere, more confidence. If you know each other, it's like in private life. If first you see somebody in the streets and you don't know him, you see, well, he's pompous, he's not nice because you do not know him. If then, by chance, you get closer to him or even have a cup of coffee, I see that in the United Nations, it's exactly the same. As long as you see these people from the distance, they are rather distant, and you have the feeling they have completely different ideas. Then suddenly, when you can get together in the corridors of the UN or in the many lounges, you sit down, either you drink nothing or you have a cup of coffee, and you find out that these people all have the same worries, the same preoccupations, the longing for peace, that they have families, they have children, whether he is black, white, or yellow. You find out that they all have more or less the same problems, and they want to solve them. But it can only be done in a climate of understanding, of confidence, and this is what we are preaching in the United Nations, and what I always preach, that I really feel that the moment people learn to know each other better, they have a better chance to overcome their difficulties and to solve the problems. Well, I am personally convinced, having said all this, that if the political will exists and a minimum of confidence is restored, an arms agreement can be hammered out, even if it were only a first step leading to a more comprehensive agreement later on. I'm more in favor of a step-by-step policy. We can't solve the disarmament problem, and nuclear disarmament especially, with one stroke. This is, of course, nonsense and very naive. It needs a step-by-step approach. It's like building a house, one brick after the other, and finally you have the house. Now, the growing East-West tension also has its consequences for the efforts of the international community to deal constructively with the existing regional conflicts in the different parts of the world. The Middle East, Southern Africa, Central America, Afghanistan, and Southeast Asia are frustrating examples of these consequences. For more than 10 years, I was personally involved in such efforts and experienced the negative impact of deteriorating East-West relations on the negotiating process in this respect, because they all have their friends, their proxies in those areas, whether it's the Middle East or Asia, Africa, and therefore, as long as the two superpowers do not establish a minimum of cooperation, I do not see how we can solve those regional conflicts, whether it's in Southern Africa or in the Middle East or elsewhere. Let me just mention Lebanon. Of course, I cannot deal with all these problems, all those regional conflicts, but let me just pick up some of them. For instance, Lebanon. The Israeli invasion last year has led to a military defeat of the PLO, but it contributed to the disintegration process of the country which we are witnessing today. Lebanon is disintegrating, and I feel sorry for the country, for the people whom I know very well. I have been there many times, and I'm deeply sorry about what we are seeing today. The treaty between the Lebanese government and Israel, worked out under American auspices, was based on the assumption that Syria would sign the treaty later, the withdrawal treaty later, to withdraw the Syrian forces from Lebanon. Obviously, this was highly unrealistic. And I have, as a witness, my wife here. I told her that when I saw it, I said, look, I know the Syrians, they will never accept this. Unfortunately, I was right. She always tells me, I hope you are wrong. But all in all, I'm usually right, because I'm a realist. I know the Syrians, and I know President Assad very well. I had to fly every year, once or twice, to Damascus to negotiate the prolongation of our peacekeeping mandate on the Golan Heights, and therefore I know him very well. Assad is not a man who would accept what others have decided without his participation, and this is exactly what happened in that case. The Israelis negotiated with the Lebanese, the government of Lebanon, just controlling part of the capital, not even the country, under United States auspices, but they did not include the Syrians. And they told afterwards the Lebanese, and you negotiate with the Syrians to join. Well, the Syrians said, not with us. And that spoiled, of course, the whole issue. Psychology plays an important role in Arab countries, and this aspect has apparently been ignored by those who negotiated the troop withdrawal treaty. Therefore, we should not be surprised what we witness today. The United States is now in the process of withdrawing its peacekeeping force from Lebanon. The limited mandate which that force had made it impossible for it to play a useful role. That was evident. Perhaps its tribulations will provide the international community with a better perspective from which to assess the value of using the United Nations for peacekeeping purposes. I know how much we were criticized at the beginning when I set up UNIFIL in southern Lebanon as a buffer zone between Israel and the Palestinian forces, the PLO forces especially, how much we were criticized that we were unable, that we didn't do a good job, that there were infiltrations and all kinds of troubles. But it was never as bad as it was now later with the so-called multinational force. And I come to this point in a moment. My own feeling on this point is that a multinational force in Lebanon cannot by itself do much to help the parties to achieve a political solution. And please pay attention to what I say here. A multinational force organized outside the United Nations can function successfully, yes, when, as in the Sinai, the governments agree to its deployment and control their own armed forces accordingly. Under such conditions, a United Nations force can do so as well, needless to say, if the two sides agree and are supporting such an operation. But in a country where there is a complete lack of cooperation by clashing communal elements, as we see it in Lebanon, and where the authority of the legitimate government is confined to a very small area, now we know today only to the presidential palace. That's the only area he controls. The outlook is entirely different. In such a case, as has been amply demonstrated by the tragic attacks on members of the multinational force, the psychological influence of the peacekeeping force's presence is reduced virtually to a nullity. They can't do anything. The problem is compounded when the force presents or represents major powers. Then its every action is suspect. It will be suspect in the country. It will be accused of defending national interests and not the cause of peacekeeping. Its very presence on foreign soil becomes part of the problem. However praiseworthy the intentions of the participants, certainly they are praiseworthy, but it is a different problematic. And if, as in Lebanon, the forces of the Western powers are in close proximity to Syrian forces backed by the Soviet Union, the search for a political solution of the local problem is complicated by the looming overtones of superpower rivalry. I do not contend that if the states concerned had made a different decision and chosen to use UNIFIL, also the United Nations force which is still in southern Lebanon, to use this force in the Beirut area, the situation would be materially different. It would not, probably. UNIFIL could not have been expected to stop determined antagonists engaged in bitter intercommunal warfare, but the United Nations force would not be a major factor in the conflict. It does not represent great power interests. That everybody knows, and that is an advantage. No one would find it worthwhile, therefore, to plan an appalling terrorist attack on, let us say, forces from Fiji or Senegal. because they are in UNIFIL, together with Swedes and Finns and others, as was done against the United States Marines and the French contingent. The solution in Lebanon, my dear friends, must be a political solution. It can't be a military solution. It cannot be a solution in isolation from the other problems of the Middle East. Lebanon is part of the Middle East, and one can't isolate it from other problems in the Middle East. Whatever the fate of the PLO and Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian issue will inevitably have to figure prominently in any area settlement. The Palestinian issue remains the core of the problem. In the end, peace in the Middle East requires a comprehensive agreement on a group of interrelated problems. The step-by-step approach can help bring that eventuality closer, but it can never by itself substitute for a general comprehensive settlement. Having seen the recent failure of so many bilateral and regional efforts to solve the problem, I feel that an international conference may give a new impulse to the situation. I also believe that sooner or later, whether we like it or not, the Soviet Union will have to participate in the negotiating process, because it is only Moscow which can influence some of the parties like Syria and the Palestinians, the PLO, etc., to accept a more cooperative approach to the problem. Now, a few words about Central America, since that is so near to your country here. In my opinion, most of the troubles existing in those countries are based on social conditions. The gap between rich and poor and the incredible poverty prevailing in this region have created a social climate which led to the present political upheavals. I am convinced that these problems cannot be resolved through military means, but only through a political process without foreign intervention. Therefore, the initiative of the so-called Contadora Group, you know, these are the 4 countries of Latin America, Venezuela, Mexico, Colombia, and Panama, which is trying to work out political solutions taking into account the interests of all the parties concerned, has to be supported, should be supported. It will be a long and arduous process, no doubt about this, but it is the only way to peace and stability in the area. Incidentally, military help and training of national defense forces do not solve the problem if those forces do not have the will to fight. Very often, the fighting morale is low, which leads to the defeat of government forces. In other words, military assistance can only produce results if the troops show the necessary fighting morale and if they have ideals to fight for. Without ideals, there is no chance. El Salvador and Lebanon are cases in point. They got military help, and still it doesn't work. Of course, the issue is much broader than this. The basic cause of the turmoil that exists in Central America is, as I said, economic and social. We know that certain measures, like technical assistance, land distribution, improved educational and social services, the establishment of democratic institutions, and the like, should promote political and social stability in these countries. But that alone is not enough. What is needed is, if you will, an ideology that will energize the peoples of these countries so that they themselves will defend with political will and enthusiasm the government structures that they possess. I think that this is the basic challenge for the United States and other Western democracies in this area. We have not yet found the keys that will solve this problem. Of course, there's the Kissinger report and a number of other recommendations, but I think we haven't really found the keys that will solve this problem. I suggest that this is a line of inquiry to be pursued both in Washington, here at your university, and at other institutions of education in this country. Of course, I could now go on to talk to you about the situation in Southern Africa, Namibia, apartheid, we had the opportunity during the dinner before we came here to this room to talk a little with the participants in that dinner. And I wish to say that again there, a political solution has to be found, and I hope that the signs which we get now from South Africa and Angola, namely that both sides agree to a disengagement of military forces, SWAPO, the liberation movement on the one side, and the South African forces on the other, will create a better political climate which may perhaps later on lead to a wider agreement on the implementation of the United Nations resolution, which are in existence for many years and which should and will hopefully give independence to Namibia in the not too distant future. My dear friends, the recent political and military developments in the world are only one aspect of the international crisis. The other one is the economic situation. It is obvious that the world economy has not been functioning well for many years. Over the past decade, even the richest countries have suffered from growing unemployment, stagnant rates of economic growth, and a spiraling inflation. However, the developing countries are the ones which suffer most. Latin America, with its accumulated debts, is a case in point. Third world prosperity is directly linked to global trade. If trade expands, the world economy expands. If global trade is stagnant or constricts, the slowly beginning recovery will be threatened. Two factors are essential to ensure expanding trade. The industrial nations must avoid taking actions such as imposing quotas or tariffs that could trigger a fresh round of global protectionism. Protectionism is a great danger. On the one hand, the first world wants to help the third world, but then they introduce protectionism so that what the third world is producing can't be exported to those countries. You see the dilemma. There has to be some logic in the economic structure. This is what we are trying to explain, and I hope it will be understood. At the same time, the industrial nation must continue to provide the capital necessary to sustain a healthy volume of new lending to financially pinched third world nations. Let there be no mistake, the new lending is essential both to enable debtor nations to service existing debt obligations and thus prevent the global banking crisis, as well as to help third world nations finance trade. Countries are obliged to react, separately or together, for better or worse, to problems as they become urgent, taking the stopgap measures required while hoping that an overall improvement in future conditions will reduce the pressures. We tend to assume, for example, that America's economic recovery, which is now beginning slowly, will automatically lead to world economic recovery, while in fact there is compelling evidence that without world economic recovery, America's tentative recovery cannot be sustained. Indeed, development of the poor countries can no longer be viewed as an optional extra to be considered separately from the development of the industrialized countries themselves. Today, America's trade with developing countries exceeds in volume its trade with all of Europe, East and West, and Japan. US exports to developing countries have more than tripled since 1976. At the same time, the US market buys over 50% of all non-OPEC developing country exports of manufactured goods to industrialized nations. Exports to developing countries now support more than 5 million jobs for American workers. I don't know whether this is known. It is an enormous aspect in the relationship between North and South. On the request of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, many indebted third world nations have now begun stringent austerity programs, often as a condition to obtaining further international loans to service existing debt. The budget restraints, however, and this is the consequence, the budget restraints make it difficult to finance trade or to meet internal demands for adequate nutrition or educational programs. Therefore, social unrest has intensified in some debtor nations. We have seen it in Mexico, we have seen it in Brazil and Argentina. Since private lending is being slashed, international lending by the IMF becomes all the more important. But the new funding for the International Monetary Fund ought to be seen for what it really is, serving the legitimate self-interest of the industrialized world by sparking global trade, which in itself helps then again the third world countries. Concerted efforts of the international community, both of the public and private sectors, are in my view urgently required to preserve the modest accomplishments of the past 3 decades in the development of the countries of the third world. Such efforts are by no means charity to any country. We should not make the mistake to believe this. They should be based on enlightened self-interest of the industrialized countries. The worldwide economic interdependence which has emerged, particularly in the last decade, establishes a direct link between the well-being of the developed and the developing world. Thus, all energies should be concentrated on reversing the deteriorating human and social conditions in developing countries and integrating them more fully and responsibly into the network of the world economy. My dear friends, this brings me to the end of my speech here tonight. The challenge of peace was never greater than now. The words of the United Nations Charter to practice tolerance and to live together in peace with one another have a particular and profound meaning for all people of the world, and I think especially for the young generation. However, instead of cooperating, we are confronting each other. I wish I could tell you something better, but I have to tell you the truth. Instead of cooperating, we are confronting each other. Unfortunately, there is a disquieting tendency away from internationalism and back to nationalism, sometimes even showing signs of chauvinism. I do not believe that World War III will happen in the near future, as some people believe. I don't think it will. But we have to make sure that it does not happen by accident. Miscalculations and computer failures are the greatest danger in this regard. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends, I have tried to give you a frank and unambiguous picture of the international situation. I do not wish to minimize our problems, but I believe it is within our powers to solve them. We have the resources and we have the ability. What we need is the political will and the courage to break with past practices and to deal with the great issues of our time in a global perspective. My years at the United Nations offered me every day those harsh reminders of the world as it really is, and tantalizing glimpses of what it could be. Only the vision of a better world, a world of peace, justice, and progress for all, can sustain us in the daily struggle to meet the enormous challenges of our time. I am more convinced than ever that our greatest danger will come if we lose that vision. Thank you.
And now Dr. Waldheim has kindly agreed to take questions from the floor. There are microphones located on the sides. If you have a question, could you please move to the microphones? Dr. Waldheim.
Well, my dear friends, just go ahead and ask questions. I don't know whether I can answer them, but I shall try. Yes, please.
Dr. Waldheim, with the difficult examples of Namibia and the Western Sahara in mind, In the event that the International Court of Justice should decide in the future upon being requested to give an advisory opinion, for example, on the question of self-determination for Eritrea on the Horn of Africa, if the court should decide that any interim measures to be taken using, as it is empowered, the practice ordinarily found in disputes, to include a police force and to give court-ordered instructions to the Military Staff Committee bypassing a vote of the Security Council. This is not in a decision, but rather in an interim measure. Is there anything that specifically stands in the way besides politics?
Well, you have touched on the basic problem of the United Nations, namely the executive power. Whether it's the International Court of Justice giving advice or making a decision, or whether it's the Security Council of the United Nations as the highest organ for peace and international security, it depends on the goodwill of the countries, the governments concerned, whether such a decision is implemented or not. We have seen what happened in the case of Namibia, to which you have referred. There is a decision of the International Court of Justice which has made clear that Namibia has to become independent, and South Africa had the obligation to grant independence, but it didn't do it because they say we need it for security reasons. All kinds of other arguments were put forward, and therefore they didn't do it. And you see, there is one shortcoming, one basic shortcoming in the Charter of the United Nations, namely Chapter 7 of the Charter does foresee enforcement actions. If a country behaves badly, under the Charter, Chapter 7, a military force should be set up without or with the military advisory board in the Secretariat, the staff committee, military staff committee as it is called, in order to intervene and to punish the government which has violated the Charter by attacking another country. The only time when that happened, my dear friends, was in the Korean War. At that time, the Russians left the council when it discussed this problem and wanted to set up a peacekeeping force, because the Russians thought then the council will be paralyzed since one permanent member is missing. But there was nothing in the Charter or in the rules which wouldn't enable the remaining 4 members to make a decision, and they did it. The 4 other members made a decision to set up a peacekeeping force of the United Nations, and the Americans were leading that force, but there were Turks and other members of the force, and they fought a real war against North Korea and later on against the Chinese, mainland China. So this was the only case in the history of the United Nations where Chapter 7 was applied strictly by setting up a force to use it against an aggressor. Never later on that happened, because whenever there was such a situation, the Russians didn't quit the council, didn't leave the council, others didn't do it either. And since they all have their proxies, whenever there's a crisis in the world, there was always one or the other country or member in the Security Council which blocked, permanent member, big power, which blocked the decision by a veto. This is, of course, a shortcoming of the Charter of the United Nations, the veto power. But you know, at that time, the founding fathers were idealists. They were under the impression of that terrible Second World War. I went through that whole war, and I understand the founding fathers, that they wanted to make sure that there is never again another war. And so they set up the Charter. But the Charter was based on the assumption that there will always be understanding amongst the big powers. Whenever there's a crisis or even a conflict, the big powers, the permanent members of the Security Council, will agree to stop it and to make peace. But the ink on that document, the Charter of the United Nations in San Francisco, wasn't even dry yet when the Cold War started. The confrontation between Moscow and Washington, between East and West, and everything was paralyzed. And this is still the situation today, that we are facing this basic problem in the United Nations, which leads me to the conclusion, as long as we aren't able to achieve that minimum of cooperation amongst the big powers in the Security Council, we won't have a chance to really settle such conflicts.
Thank you for your enigmatic answer, sir.
Dr. Wolheim?
I say, ladies, where are you? I don't know. Where? Oh, yeah, please, okay.
Because of the seeming lack of solutions in Lebanon and in regional conflicts in Africa, do you foresee a day where we'll see the partition of Lebanon and the redrawing of national boundaries in Africa, or must the sanctity of borders be maintained as it now stands?
Well, in Africa, the sanctity of the borders was more or less agreed by the Organization of African Unity. They have decided that the former colonial borders should be maintained, that they should not be changed, because if they did that, if they were to do this, it would open up a Pandora box. You wouldn't have any borders anymore in Africa. It would be a complete disaster, because those borders were established under the colonial rule, and now the Africans say, well, it's better we keep them, although they are not ideal, but it's better not to touch upon them. And there was an agreement of the Organization of African Unity to respect those borders. Now, as far as other parts of the world are concerned, for instance, Lebanon, well, I'm afraid it may come to that point that the country is disintegrating. As it looks now, it looks very gloomy, and I don't see how a quick solution can be found. It looks like the status quo will continue, and I think that the best we can hope for is that it does not deteriorate, and that after the withdrawal of the multinational force, a United Nations peacekeeping force will be introduced, although that force won't be able to achieve a political settlement, but at least it can contribute to calming the situation. And then there has to be a government in Lebanon composed of all factions. You can't expect a reasonable solution, a political solution of the problems in the country, as long as they don't have a government composed of all factions, or the main factions at least. Now, in the past, it was always composed of, or the Christian influence, the Maronite Christian influence was predominant, and the Muslims were most unhappy about this. This, of course, goes back to the end of the First World War, and it was then during the at the end of the Second World War reconfirmed. But frankly, this country, which once belonged to Syria, as you know, the stability of that country depends on the cooperation of those many factions, Muslim, Shiites, Druze, Christians. And I think as long as the leadership in the country, the leaders of those many parties, there are dozens of them, do not agree on a government composed of their representatives, I don't see what peacekeeping forces can do. They can only occupy it, and they don't want to do that. Why? So what is necessary is, first, to set up a new government, provisional government, whatever we call it, where most of the more important factions are represented. And then to have peacekeeping forces in order to work out the details, to set up again a Lebanese army. I mentioned a moment ago the political aspects in such an army, ideology. They have to know for what they are fighting. The Lebanese army today doesn't know for what it is fighting. It is composed. It was composed. It has disintegrated. It doesn't exist anymore, as you know. But it was composed of very different forces, militias from the Christians, the Shiites, the Druze, and others. And they fought each other finally because they had no common aim. So to conclude, I think the dangers of disintegration are very great in Lebanon. It can only be avoided if now, after the withdrawal of the multinational force, the parties inside the country, the political parties, the factions get together, form a new government, and try to restore the integrity of the country. I'm skeptic. I can tell you immediately that it will take a long time. Yeah, you're next.
Dr. Waldheim, you criticized public diplomacy, and I was wondering if you thought there are any alternatives given the necessities of the democratic process, especially in America at the moment. What alternatives are there?
Alternatives to public diplomacy? Well, to use the diplomacy, the traditional diplomacy which you have, of course also in this country, and you have it in most of the other countries. This is a speciality. Perhaps I am a little rough to say this, but this is an American speciality to discuss everything publicly. Of course, I'm all in favor of an open society, but it shouldn't go as far as discussing even military secrets in public. I used to say once, why do the Russians need spies? If they read the magazines in this country and the newspapers carefully, they know everything which is going on in this country. So what I mean is, you remember when, I don't want to get involved in domestic politics, but I remember in a similar situation when Averell Harriman was going to Moscow, quietly negotiating with the Russians and coming back with results. What I want to say is, don't make public statements all the time which are printed in the newspapers and which are mainly for domestic consumption, so that the public knows that something is going on. But that doesn't solve the problem. Do it quietly. In Europe, for instance, this is completely different. In the Western countries of Europe, it's different. They don't say everything publicly. And I think this is also one of the reasons why there are sometimes differences between the Western Europeans and the Americans. Because they say, my God, you can't do that. But here in this country, apparently, one feels the public has to know everything. And if we intend to make a new proposal to the Russians in the disarmament field, we first say it publicly, and it is first printed in the New York Times, and the Washington Post, and in New York Globe and Mail, or whatever it is here, and then the Russians read it in the papers. And perhaps 2 or 3 days later, or a week later, when they have their next meeting in Geneva, they get it formally presented by the American delegate, but they will say, yes, we know already, we have read it a week ago.
Dr. Waldheim?
Yeah.
In your speech and in your answer to the first question, you spoke of a minimum of cooperation or goodwill, which we need in order for the UN to accomplish its goals. Well, do you think there's any way to teach this sort of goodwill, or, I mean, any way that we can make it come about other than just hoping?
Other just hoping. Yeah. Well, to be frank, I think the public in this country especially, but also, of course, in Western Europe, in the Western world in general, can help. Because a Western democracy, whether it's here or in Europe, can only survive if it is supported by the public. If it is not supported by the public, it has no chance to survive. Elections are every 4 years, whether it's here or in Europe, it's always 4 years. And therefore, they must get the support of the public. So if you want to influence the policy of your country or of any other country, then one has to express firm views in this regard. You have your representatives in Congress, you can talk to them because they all have their constituencies, and one can express certain wishes which they then have to present to the Congress, and the Congress again has a possibility to express its wishes to the government. And it is similar, of course, in the European countries. It doesn't always work. Sometimes the government says, okay, well, we take note of it. We are not happy with what you are saying, telling us, and what you are saying. We do what we like and not what you want. But I think that the public, whether it's the old generation or the young one, especially in the field of disarmament, has certainly a possibility to express its views in a dignified way. It doesn't have to be some demonstrations as we have seen it in the past. It has to be done, and you have the constitutional possibility through your representatives, but in any other way there are so many possibilities. The newspapers, of course, are also expressing their views, or the views of, sometimes not always, of the public, and in this way you can influence the attitude and the actions of governments. Yeah.
Dr. Waldheim, I wanted to ask you a question concerning your brief analysis on Latin America, on Central America.
and mainly your conclusion that, if I understood it well, was that more thought must be given to the problem here in the United States by the government and in the universities and other institutes. And I'm wondering exactly what role do you think the people of those countries that are involved in the problem have to play, and if there is one, or if the problem will be solved by the superpowers?
Well, it is of course a pity that the people in the countries concerned do not have the possibility to influence in a better way the fate of their own country. You see, let me compare this with the developments in my own small country, Austria. We were occupied for 10 years after the Second World War, and I was a member of our negotiating team with the four occupying powers, the so-called Allied powers. The three Western powers made no difficulties. They wanted to give us our freedom back because we were forced to become part of Germany. We were not in war, the state of war with the Allied powers. But the Soviet authorities were not ready to sign the treaty. And if we had at that time, and therefore I mentioned this example, if we hadn't cooperated at that time, if the people of Austria hadn't cooperated, socialists, Christian Democrats, even Marxists, liberals, if they hadn't all wanted to get the country free from occupation, it would never have worked. Incidentally, Austria is the only country where the Russians withdrew voluntarily. It was a miracle. Nobody believed this anymore. They said the Austrians are naive to believe that the Russians will ever withdraw. They did, because we really negotiated with them patiently and with perseverance, and we were united. They knew that the country was united, the people was united, and we had one concrete aim, ideologically, politically. We wanted to belong to the Western world, but we were ready to accept neutrality following the Swiss pattern, which means part of the Western world, but still militarily being neutral. And that was accepted. So what I want to say is, if those countries, those people in Central America, if they were united, if they did know what they want, I'm sure that it would be possible to solve the problem. But it isn't. There is this deep division in those countries between leftists and rightists and extremists and moderates, etc. Therefore, it opens up to foreign intervention.
If I can make one additional comment, I am thinking particularly about the case of Nicaragua, for example. It seems that there the people know what they want. And before the Sandinista government came to power, there was a dictatorship for more than 30 years, and nobody cared here about that situation. And so I very much appreciate your example, but I don't know if it works always in that sense.
I see what you mean. Well, I think as long as it is clear that the government represents the wish of the people, there should be no question and no doubt that the government has to be supported. The moment that disappears and the people turn against the government, then the situation is different. But I really believe that as long as the people support the government, there should be no doubt in the minds of others.
I'm afraid our time for tonight is up. I'd like to thank Dr. Waldheim for his frank and very enlightening remarks.